You want to know what it feels like when the world you built to be safe turns into a cage overnight? Well, I can tell you it starts with something as small as a lawn being half an inch too long, or a trash can left out 10 minutes past the deadline. My name is Elias Thorne. No relation to the guy I'm about to tell you about. Thank God. And for 15 years, I lived the life of a man who thought he'd left the war behind in the dust of the Middle East, only to find out that sometimes the most dangerous enemies don't wear foreign fatigues. They wear cheap polyester badges and carry clipboards in your own suburban cul-de-sac. It was a Tuesday, one of those crisp October mornings in Silver Creek where the air tastes like wood smoke and expensive lattes, and my daughter, Maya, was doing what any 16-year-old does, walking to school with her headphones on, probably listening to something I'd think was too loud. I've spent my life training guys for the kind of situations you see in movies. The Tier 1 operators, the guys who go where the maps are blank. And I'd always told Maya that the world isn't as soft as the manicured lawns of our neighborhood, but I never thought she'd have to prove me right 2 blocks from our front door. She was just crossing the intersection of Pine and Maple when this white, unmarked Explorer, one of those vehicles that tries so hard to look official, ends up looking predatory, slid up beside her with the kind of precision that makes your neck hairs stand up. 2 guys stepped out, and let me tell you, these wearing an Oppos, T-cops, they were in, quote, safety officers, in quote, from the Silver Creek Residential Oversight, or SCRO, which is just a fancy name for the HOA's personal goon squad. The leader was a guy named Miller, a man with a buzz cut that was too tight and a sense of self-importance that was even tighter, a guy who'd probably been rejected from the academy 3 times and decided that harassing teenagers was the next best thing to serving the public. Maya, she's a smart kid. She pulls her earbuds out, and she's looking at them, thinking maybe they're lost. But Miller, he starts in on her with this oily, practiced authority, telling her she's, in quote, loitering with intent, in quote, and that her vintage band hoodie, a gift from me, mind you, was, in quote, in violation of the community's aesthetic standards for public conduct, end quote. It sounds like a joke, right? Something you'd hear in a bad sitcom. But when Maya tried to just walk away, Miller's partner, a hulking guy who looked like he'd spent more time at the buffet than the gym, stepped in her path. Miller told her they were taking her in for, in quote, administrative processing, in quote, a phrase that should never be applied to a child walking to school. And when she reached for her phone to call me, that didn't in Oppos. To stop her, they snapped zip ties on her wrists so hard they left bruises that stayed for a week. Now imagine me, sitting in my home office, reviewing tactical drills when I get a call from the school at 10:30 asking why Maya ISN in Oppos, T in her AP history class, and in that split second, the father in me freezes, but the soldier in me takes the wheel. My blood didn't in Oppos. T just run cold. It turned to liquid nitrogen, but the training kicks in. You don in Oppos. T panic. You process. I was out the door in 60 seconds, my eyes scanning the pavement like I'm looking for IEDs in a canyon. And when I found her phone lying in the gutter near the park, cracked and silent, that's when I knew this wasn't Oppos. T, a misunderstanding. It was a declaration of war. I didn't in Oppos. T called the police right away, and maybe that's the part people will judge. But in Silver Creek, the local precinct was basically in the pocket of the HOA board, and I knew if I wanted my daughter back before they, in quote, processed, in quote, her into a trauma she'd never recover from, I had to be the one to do it. I tracked down 2 HOA maintenance guys near the clubhouse, guys I'd shared beers with before, and I didn't in Oppos. T have to raise my voice. There's a certain look a man gets when he's ready to dismantle the world to find his kid, and they saw it. They told me Miller had been, in quote, cleaning up the streets, in quote, lately, taking people to the old utility substation at the edge of the property, a place the HOA had converted into a makeshift detention center under the guise of, in quote, security upgrades, end quote. The sun was starting to dip, casting these long, jagged shadows across the neighborhood, and I approached that substation not as a neighbor, but as a ghost. I've spent 20 years teaching the best in the business how to disappear in broad daylight, and Miller's, in quote, patrol, in quote, was a joke. They were amateurs playing at being gods. I watched them for 20 minutes from the tree line, seeing the way they lounged around, smoking and laughing, while my daughter was locked in a concrete room with no windows, and the fury I felt was something I had to cage just to keep my hands steady. I took out the first guard near the perimeter fence before he even finished his cigarette. A simple sleeper hold, gentle but absolute. And I moved into that building like smoke through a keyhole. I found Maya in a back room, sitting on a metal chair, her face pale but her eyes fierce. And when she saw me, she didn't in oppose. T scream, she just breathed out and quote, "Dad," and quote. And I knew she'd been holding her breath for hours. I cut those ties off her, felt the heat of the rage in my chest when I saw the marks on her skin, and I told her to stay behind me, to be the shadow I taught her to be. But I wasn't into oppos, T leaving until I saw Miller. I found him in what he called his, quote, command center, quote, which was just a room full of monitors showing feeds from people's front porches, a voyeuristic little kingdom built on the dues we paid every month. He was on the phone, laughing about how he was going to, quote, teach the Walker kid a lesson about respect, quote. And when I stepped into the light, the look on his face wasn't oppos. T just fear. It was the realization that he'd spent his life bullying people who couldn't and oppos. T fight back, and he'd finally kicked the wrong door. He tried to reach for a taser on his belt, but I was across that room before his brain could even send the signal to his hand, and I had him pinned against the wall, the air leaving his lungs in a ragged wheeze. Quote, you think this is a game? Quote, I whispered, and I wasn't oppos. T shouting, I was speaking with the weight of every man I've ever trained. Quote, you think you can take a child off the street because you don and oppos? T like her clothes? You're not a cop. Miller, you're a kidnapper in a bad uniform, and your little empire ends tonight. Quote. I didn't in oppos. T break him, even though every cell in my body wanted to, because I wanted him to see the legal system he'd tried to mimic crush him instead. I had Maya call a friend of mine, a real federal prosecutor, while I sat there in the dark with Miller and his cohorts tied up with their own zip ties, watching the bravado leak out of them until they were nothing but crying men in a cold room. The aftermath was a slow-motion car crash for the Silver Creek HOA. It turned out the board president had been funneling hundreds of thousands into this, quote, security initiative, quote, which was really just a way to intimidate residents into selling their homes cheap so his brother's development firm could flip them. It wasn't oppos. T just about Maya. It was a criminal enterprise hidden behind the, quote, best lawn, quote, awards and the 4th of July parades. By the time the feds were done, the HOA was bankrupt, the board was in orange jumpsuits, and Miller was looking at 10 to 15 for kidnapping and impersonation. We renamed the neighborhood, quote, the Commons, quote. After that, tore down the gates and fired the security guards, but the silence that sits over our street now feels different. It's not the silence of forced perfection, it's the silence of a place that's finally breathing. Maya walks to school now with her head up, and yeah, she still wears those hoodies, and every time I see her, I'm reminded that the only thing that stands between us and the people who want to control us is the willingness to stand up and say, quote, no more, quote. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night, and I want you to really think about this. How many other Millers are out there right now, hiding behind a, quote, community policy, quote, or a, quote, safety guideline, quote, waiting for a kid who doesn't in oppos? Do you have a father like me? Is your neighborhood actually safe? Or is it just quiet because everyone's too afraid to speak up? I want to hear your stories. Have you ever seen a local power trip go too far? And did anyone have the guts to stop it? Because if we don and oppos, T watch the watchers. Who's going to stop them from coming for your door next? Drop a comment. Let's talk about where the line between safety and tyranny actually sits, because I'm starting to think it's a lot thinner than we want to admit.